My name is Joe Cernik. I'm a member of the faculty here at Lindenwood University, and I want to welcome you to Insight. Now, Insight is a show where we discuss books on politics, both domestically and internationally, sometimes historical books that provide a perspective on the present, and sometimes broader developmental books that help to put politics into a broader setting. I suspect that's what it is with the book that we are going to be discussing today. It's written by someone named Nichols. And the title of the book is called The Death of Expertise, The Campaign Against Established Knowledge and Why It Matters. Now, joining me on the show today are three Lindenwood University students. To my immediate right is Tania Contreras. To Tania's right is Johnny Peddicord. And to Johnny's right is Marina Vela. Now, I wanted to read an opening quote from the book and then have the members of the panel sort of respond to it, and then we'll jump into a discussion about the book. It gives a sense of how to sort of give you a feel for where the author's coming from. He writes, "While expertise isn't dead, it's in trouble. Something is going terribly wrong. The United States is now a country obsessed with the worship of its own ignorance. It's not just that people don't know a lot about science or politics or geography. They don't. But that's an old problem. We live in a society that works because of a division of labor. Pilots fly planes, lawyers file lawsuits, doctors prescribe medication. No, the bigger problem is that we're proud of not knowing things. Americans have reached a point where ignorance, especially anything related to public policy, is an actual virtue. To reject the advice of experts is to assert autonomy, a way for Americans to insulate their increasingly fragile egos from ever being told they're wrong about anything."
So I first wanted to start off by saying that I don't completely agree with everything that the author says. I think he comes from a very conservative perspective, and you can see that throughout the book. Even though he does make attacks towards both the liberal side and the conservative side, he often more than not makes more attacks towards the liberal side. Like when he mentions that liberals are more likely to unfriend somebody because they have disputes over political issues. And he also talks against a lot of liberal colleges, specifically pointing out how the majority of the people who go to those colleges tend to adopt a liberal ideology. Secondly, I don't think that the United States has essentially adopted ignorance as a virtue because of the fact that the word ignorance itself still has a negative connotation. So it's not like people are going out and actually actively trying to be ignorant. Instead, it's more of people are trying to learn more than what they're capable of learning, and that comes across as them being ignorant. But I don't think that anybody actually actively tries to be ignorant. So to call it a virtue seems a little bit misplaced.
Okay.
I think I kind of tend to agree with that. However, with the added aspect that gaining information is laborious. Being able to get information is laborious. And with a wealth of information readily available, it takes a lot of work to go out and search that information. I think at the end of the day, we could just look and say that people are can be inherently lazy. And I think that it's a lot easier for them to be able to spew out factoids than actually gain information and parse knowledge in the ability to analyze that knowledge.
Agreeing with them, I think the worst thing here is that young people don't have the necessity to know more. They are not interested in learning new things and being more knowledge because they know they can rely on an expert or someone else that they will provide them the answers.
It isn't just young people he's talking about. I think he has a chapter certainly on college. But in a broader sense, he's talking about a way of him generally looking at a broader public. And I certainly think one of the themes is knowing and understanding, that there are people that want to sort of know a little bit of vignettes of things. And the idea of saying, well, okay, but do you clearly sort of understand how to look at something in a broader way? Difference between being a history buff and a historian, okay, in that sense.
And I think that that fine line between what really constitutes an expert and what is an expert is honestly not very well defined within the book. His entire first chapter is called What is an Expert? And he tries to hint at what an expert actually is. But then later on, if you move on to, I think it's chapter 5, when he's talking about the media and when he's talking about news sources, he criticizes the news sources despite him not being a journalist. And he tries to justify it by saying, well, I've read a lot of newspapers continuously and I read articles a lot of times. But under his own logic within his first chapter, he doesn't qualify as an expert in journalism enough to criticize it. So to me, I don't really understand how to criticize the book because he makes a lot of really good arguments, especially in regards to post-secondary education, where we're essentially seeing a lot of universities or a lot of colleges call themselves universities in order to attract more students, despite not having the faculty to support it. Those are really good arguments. But in the sense, I think overall, it just comes across as somebody who is an expert in a specific field, trying to apply his knowledge in political science to everybody else, telling everybody else that they're not experts in fields that I feel like you sort of have to analyze on a case-by-case basis instead of saying a broad generalization, everybody's an idiot sort of thing, if that makes sense.
The word expert, and I like that part of the book where he has trouble trying to define experts, because we do use terms in discussion of politics and people throw terms out without spending time to explain them or say, what are you talking about exactly? And my big government, sometimes even terms like liberal and conservative, they get thrown around and I'm a little confused. I go, I'm not quite sure what you're referring to and how, and so you sort of have these images without what are you clearly saying?
Sure. I think that though his main point is that people are equivocating being able to search something on Google or look up something on WebMD and that being just as sufficient, if not necessary, to being a doctor than actually going to 10 years of medical school. I think an expert is somebody who you intentionally seek out and make deference to gain knowledge that they've spent their entire life obtaining and have spent considerable amounts of resources analyzing and retaining. So I think as far as experts go, I think that is kind of his go-to. I don't necessarily agree with it in all aspects and in all cases, but I think that his main point is that people think that because information is so widely available, all they have to do is spend a few hours on Wikipedia and they're just as good as an academic.
Yeah.
I think there's a lack of self-criticism because people think they are an expert just because, as you said, going to Wikipedia or wherever to search something. But like a person with a college degree is not an expert.
Well, he's certainly trying to create that feeling that it takes a while to learn something. And that he says one of the worst things you want to hear as a college professor, and I agree, is, well, I did a little research. And he has that quote in there. And I go, oh, goodness, do I really want to hear that? Thinking, wait a minute, have you done a lot of reading? Let's sit down and go through the process that you can talk about something in an in-depth, substantial way, as opposed to some flipping around here, there, everywhere. And that's a whole different sort of way of looking at something. Basically, like I'd say, when I'm teaching you in classes, I'm trying to get you to address dilemma and conundrum, difficult choices, that you don't have sort of simple either or. Why I don't use terms like gun control and say, are you for it or against it? It doesn't make any sense. When you talk about degrees of gun regulation, now it gets more difficult. Why you want to not use the term big government, but to say, well, what are you talking about precisely? Which programs are we looking at, or how are we looking at the relationship of the federal government to the states? And so you avoid sort of the simplicity, and that makes it more difficult. That expert maybe is sort of towards that idea of you start thinking a different way.
Sure, and I think that just speaks to the intellectual laziness that he kind of talks about in the book, where the death of expertise is really stemming from inequality of opinions and equivocating those opinions to facts. So therefore, my opinion is just as good as an expert, as somebody who spent their entire life studying and analyzing something just because I've spent a few minutes on Wikipedia.
He has a good quote. He said, "These are dangerous times. Never have so many people had so much access to so much knowledge and yet have been so resistant to learning anything. And then he brought this up in relationship to a poll that had been done in the Washington Post, where they asked people if they're willing for the United States to go to war in the Ukraine. And they found that once they said, yes, I'm willing to go to war in the Ukraine, the people that were most willing to say, yes, let's go to war in the Ukraine, were then asked, well, where is it? And they go, I don't know. And so that you found there was this odd relationship. The more you didn't know where something was, the more likely we were to support the idea of going to war.
And it's funny because he also brings up a different study where they had people of all different varieties of intelligence levels and asked them if they knew what certain things were. And they actually made up certain places, places that didn't exist, or historical events that never happened. And he would ask them, did you hear about this? And people who were more intellectually qualified would actually, admit that they didn't know what the thing was, while people who didn't want to seem like they were dumb would go ahead and say, yeah, I've heard of it, despite not really knowing about it. And I think a lot of what you were talking about, a lot of our bias towards believing some things and maybe not doing enough research, a lot of it stems from our own confirmation bias, whereas if I already have an internal belief that something is the way that I think that it is, I'm less likely to look for research or look at instances that prove my own internal belief wrong. And he gives the example of a man who is terrified of airplanes. Whenever he goes on an airplane, he's always going to think about all the airplanes that have crashed. He's never going to consider all of the airplanes that have, carefully landed and stuff like that, which I think is really interesting.
I think that plays into the Dunning-Kruger effect that he goes into, which I found fascinating. That you have this lack of awareness that essentially feeds more lack of awareness. Like the less you know, the less you're likely, or the more you think you know. And something my father always said was, the empty can rattles loudest. And the person who knows the least tends to expound upon the fact that they know something, or at least they're the expert on something. You see that at the Thanksgiving dinner table quite a bit when Aunt Rhonda wants to talk about gun control or abortion or what have you. She's immediately the authority on whatever it is because she's read a few articles.
Yeah, I found that we did a TV show here some years ago with a judge in town, and you always have people on TV, I'm opposed to Roe v. Wade, and I thought, well, why don't we approach it differently? And so we did this half-an-hour show about, well, what would an opinion actually look like coming out of the United States Supreme Court that wanted to overturn Roe v. Wade? Well, now that was a whole different approach, and it was a whole more complex thought process than simply give my quick opinion on something ridiculously off the top of my head. And so unfortunately you see that a lot. There's a nice quote he has: we now live in a society where the acquisition of even a little learning is the end point rather than the beginning of education, and this is a very dangerous thing.
I think the universities and the educational system yet change, and they provide the students like the critical thinking, and they can have opinion about everything, even they don't know the things. So I think the college has changed as well, and people now think they know, and they are smarter than the other ones, and they are more intellectuals, and they will argue instead of questioning themselves if maybe they are wrong. They will argue with the other ones.
A lot of his attack is on the internet, so that it's wonderful, and I love, because we teach here how to do research online, and that's critical to know how to do that. But yeah, there's also a way to understand how to use the internet and become aware of how you're doing it. Certainly one of the things that he says, which I've known from numerous other studies, is that when people sometimes look at something on the internet, they don't really read the whole thing. They're sort of reading maybe the first few paragraphs, and that's good enough, and then they move on.
Yeah, and oftentimes even, he talks about it in his journalistic chapter, where a lot of newspapers, even some highly I guess, loved newspapers, will actually use those clickbait taglines in order to get more views, because at the end of the day, most of these newspapers and most of these ads that run online and all of that stuff is the end goal is to make money. And so the more views that you can have on your content, the better that your business will do. And so we've moved away from having like full reached articles going into deep detail about the issues that you're wanting to talk about, to essentially just trying to trim it down into a single sentence that you know will trigger people into either clicking on it or telling other people about it, or even maybe being enraged about it for some reason. It seems like it's very popular, especially if you go onto Facebook. You'll see a ton of those all the time.
And I think that brings up a good point too, that social media, and as much as I poo-poo on social media, it can be a very, very good thing. But it's essentially, we've gone from having just a village idiot in each village to having a community of village idiots that can get together and share their misinformation. Things like the anti-vaccination movement, things like all the misinformation that came out from the Affordable Care Act, everything that came about, CBO reports. You mentioned you tell somebody, look up the CBO report. They don't know. They don't want to know. So it allows this group of people who don't necessarily, who click on these clickbait news articles to share this information and talk about this information and perpetuate this information. I think that can be kind of dangerous.
And a lot of people will trust like those sites that are not like good sites, or the information they found and the answers they provide the internet. They will rely on them and like asking and arguing about those answers, and those answers can be wrong, and we know there's a lot of misinformation on the internet and people will trust. So I think they have to accurate the research and learn how to define the good information and trust some other site.
He has this thing called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And so he refers to that. Again, it's the Dunning-Kruger effect, and basically it means the dumber you are, the more confident you feel about stating your positions. And I like the way he developed that, because there is a lot of truth in that. And it's something, again, in classes, I notice that myself and, say, other teachers, we're trying to sort of also let you have a feeling of the limitations of what we know and what we don't know that we need to try to learn about, and that the more you learn, the more you become aware of, at times, how little you know.
Well, one of my favorite philosophers of all time once stated, the only thing that I know is that I know nothing. And I think that's a good starting point for anybody who's trying to improve their intellectual level. Back when I was in high school, for example, we used to have a lot of students who were in debate class, and we were very competitive. And essentially, you could divide the entire group into two people, the people who really cared about it and the people who really didn't care about it. And the people who really cared about doing well in debate would often tell themselves that they weren't good enough for the next debate, because they felt as if the previous time that they spoke, they either didn't speak well enough, or they didn't do enough research, or maybe their points just weren't great enough. While the people who tended not to do very well would always come out of a debate thinking, man, I did great on that. And at the end of the day, you could really see the difference between somebody who is a lot more self-critical, could see their own flaws within maybe the first few rounds to improve to the next rounds, between the people who just simply thought that they did perfect the first time and they didn't get very far. So I definitely do think that people who are more talented or maybe have greater experience in certain areas are more critical of themselves because they have that higher standard for themselves than those who are simply trying to get by with saying that they can do something.
And I think that's metacognition. I think that you have to realizing what you don't know. And I think that the big problem with that, not that there's a problem with it inherently, but I think the big problem with that is that you have to have the humility required to admit to yourself, I don't know something. And that takes a lot of maturity, and it takes a lot of, again, humility and humbling yourself and bringing yourself.
I think that's part of the educational process. He's trying to say people don't want to do, rather than if they say, no, I have a little knowledge, so I bypass the process. Well, the process of learning is learning about, hey, this is difficult, and I'm learning that I don't know a lot of things. And that it's nice to actually hear that on TV, but I don't see it on commercial TV. I've seen it occasionally on C-SPAN, which few watch.
And the funny thing is that people that they are not competent or unskilled, they will rate themselves like above average, but they are, in fact, they are under average, but they don't realize. And the book says that we all like overestimate ourselves, but people like who knows less or more or less competent, they do that more.
What do you think about his whole selection? He was talking about colleges. I think he called it students as customers.
Customers, yeah. I think his big critique was that higher education has gone from an educational focus, where their entire goal is to provide rigor and education to a student and allow them to think critically, to a client service. It's no different than essentially Disneyland, where you're providing a customer with an experience, and you're fighting for their tax or their tuition dollars. It's this huge competition where we want your tuition dollars, we want to give you what you want, rather than you want an education, you come to us and you give us your tuition dollars. I think that's completely switched the dynamic of what an educational institution is supposed to be.
My criticism, I guess, of that chapter was that as he's saying, well, this is the problem is you're not talking to students and sort of understanding their students, don't treat them like a customer where you're trying to be too nice, as I'm going, well, okay, wait a minute, tell me precisely if you're looking at, say, the same course taught in 3 or 4 different places, these colleges, these universities, how exactly is it presented here more in a traditional, yes, this is what you want to do way, versus here, it's not. And I guess I would have liked to seen some reference points to that.
I completely agree with what you're saying. I honestly feel like a lot was missing from this book. If he's trying to argue that we've become more self-interested or more fragile in our egos because of the internet, because of institutions, because of the different reasons that he gives throughout the book, I feel like you have to give a before. Like, what was the before that we've shifted away from into this veil of ignorance? And he never goes into the past. It's always the now. In regards to the universities, too, I think he still can make a decent point without looking at specific colleges. I would have preferred that, but without looking at specific colleges, because he does bring up the fact that the average grade in America is now actually an A, despite the bell curve telling you that not everybody can be a genius. So I think you can go off of that to make a lot of the arguments that he makes within his 3rd chapter, but I still agree that he definitely needed a lot more specific examples.
What I think is that if you get an A, like, you are not a genius.
Yeah.
You are like a good student. You are studying and you are doing your job in college, that is study. Like, people who got Fs, they are like not good students and they are lazy. They don't want to do anything.
Well, there's nothing wrong with trying to, as a teacher, I don't want to give an F or a D. I always sort of assume that students give it to themselves, but you're trying to show a path to how to do well. And as a result, because eventually you're leaving here to get a job, so you're trying to apply those higher standards to then going out to work. I was talking with an attorney in town and working at a major law firm, and they realized that a lot of the lawyers that they were hiring, they had to teach them to write well. They already got their law degrees, and you're thinking, didn't you learn that from college and law school? And he was saying, no, they actually had to bring in somebody to help in the process of teaching them how to write well. And I thought that was an interesting process. So in the sense of thinking, I wasn't what I was thinking you'd be even considering.
And it actually furthers along the question of who is an expert. If the institutions that are supposed to create these experts in law and in medicine and et cetera, then if the education system that's supposed to produce them as experts in the first place is failing, well, then how do you really consider who is an expert at the end of the day? Because obviously to him, the law degree or simply a medical degree isn't enough. There's something else that's there. And maybe it is just experience, hence the word expertise. But it still seems like there's so much gray area in determining who does qualify as knowing something besides somebody who doesn't. Obviously, somebody who went to law school is going to know somebody who didn't, more than somebody who didn't, but still somebody who just graduated from law school is not going to know as much as somebody who has done multiple cases.
Sure, and I think that's what his point was that an expert isn't the end-all, be-all. It doesn't know everything about it, but they know more than the layperson does. They do. The F student from law is going to know more about law, whether they know it or not, than somebody who's never watched an episode of Law and Order. You know what I mean? I think that the equivocation of that is a little off base, but I do understand where you're coming from. Where what does make an expert? And I do think that just having that education in a lot of senses makes you an expert, maybe not in your field, maybe you're not the best lawyer, maybe you're not being deferred to by other attorneys, maybe you're not a judge, but you're at least going to be deferred to by the layperson, which I think is important.
We only have a few minutes left, so are you recommending TV audience members listening to our discussion read the book or not read the book?
I think they should definitely read the book, but I think that when you read this book, and especially almost any book that's very critical of the reader, I think that you have to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt, or at least be a little bit more skeptical about everything that he tells you. Look at the examples are true, the examples are right, but at the overall picture, you sort of have to take the knowledge that he gives you and apply it to the real world and determine that way if you really think that his point gets across or not. Definitely recommend it though, it is an easy read for sure, and you just have to make your own judgments on it.
I agree. I would recommend this book, and I think that the one thing I learned and the one thing I took away, and I think that anybody could take away from this book, is that you have to kind of admit to yourself that you don't know everything, and that there is times when you have to defer to other people who may know. You may be studying something I've never studied before, don't know about. I'm going to come to you, and that's okay. That shouldn't be me coming to you with my hat in my hand. That should be me trying to better myself as a human being and gain knowledge. So yeah, I think that that was what I took away from the book. Not essentially that he is being critical of me as a reader, but as he's being critical of society in general, which I think I'm certainly critical of society.
I would also recommend the book because I think I see myself reflected in some examples and how there's a lot of misinformation that people really trust. So and the book also provides a lot of examples, so it's an easy reading. So I will recommend the books for the students.
My criticism was, I think it's not bad to discuss this, but certainly it's one of the big problems comes from TV. That people see TV and TV doesn't really help them to become aware of, well, having knowledge and what does it mean in the process of learning. So you, as a result, develop very simplistic ways of sort of understanding, whereas if you see something on C-SPAN, which therefore I advise people to do more so than to watch commercial TV, is you see a longer discussion of at least something, and you sometimes will see presentations, and they'll do sort of not just sort of an interview process with an author, but you have things like book TV, and you then on C-SPAN where you can sort of get a feeling for, gee, this is the process, and there's an evolution and a development to something, and you don't get any of that on regular TV. So he doesn't have anything about TV, which I think has a bad influence on people. We know that as a result of TV, many people stopped reading newspapers. So as a result, that's not a good thing. So a very good discussion, and so I think we all at least agree, read the book. Sure. Thank you for joining us today.